Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Welcome to the Sell with Authority podcast, presented by our friends at Conduit Digital. I'm Stephen Wessner, CEO of Predictive ROI, and my team and I, we created this podcast specifically for you. So if you're an agency owner looking to sell more of what you do for a higher fee, then you're in the right place. Do you want proven strategies for becoming the known expert in your niche and attracting all the clients that you need? Yep, we're going to cover that. You want to learn how to step away from the sea of sameness so you actually stand out from your competitors and own the ground you're standing on? Yep, we're going to cover that too. Do you want to future-proof your business so you can successfully navigate the next challenge that you know is going to come your way? Well, absolutely, we will help you there as well. I promise you, each episode of this podcast will contain valuable insights, tangible examples, and best practices, never theory, from thought leaders, experts, owners who have done exactly what you're working hard to do. So I want you to think practical and tactical, never any fluff. Each of our guests have built a position of authority and then monetized that position by growing their audience, by nurturing leads, and yes, by converting sales. But all the while, they did it by being helpful. So every time someone from their audience turned around, there they were with a helpful answer to an important question. So their prospects never, ever felt like they were a prospect. I also promise you, every strategy that we discuss, every tool we recommend will be shared in full transparency in each episode so you can fill your sales pipeline with a steady stream of right fit clients and sell more of what you do. Okay, so I am super excited for you to meet our special guest expert today, Dan Englander. So if you're meeting Dan for the first time, he's the CEO and founder of Sales Schema, which is a fractional new business team for marketing agencies. He's also the host of the Digital Agency Growth Podcast and the author of the book, Relationship Sales at Scale. So before I welcome Dan to the show, I'm going to share some brief excerpts from part 2 of his book because the excerpts perfectly frame up, in my opinion, a challenge agency owners and their teams face when thinking about business development, when they think about prospecting, when they think about how to open doors well, and how to do it at scale instead of the onesie, twosie, time-consuming approach. And that challenge is how to keep the agency sales pipeline full by balancing personalization and scale. Well, thankfully for us, this balancing act is an area of deep expertise for Dan. So here we go. Page 39, part 2 of Relationship Sales at Scale. So this is me quoting Dan. The scarce commodity is no longer information. It's trust. While building trust can be challenging, the good news is that going in cold is no longer necessary. Your outreach does not have to summit a mountain, but rather walk over a small hill, since the goal is not to build the trust needed to close a deal, but just enough to de-risk a conversation and create a relationship. Okay, so end quotes. So as you'll hear in this interview, I'm going to ask Dan why he believes so strongly in the excerpt that I just shared with you, and how that excerpt, along with Dan's belief that balancing personalization and scale is possible, will lead us into breaking down the 5 circles of influence, as well as the 6th circle that Dan introduces in his book, and how you can best open doors at scale once you've built the right list. Okay, so without further ado, welcome to the Sell with Authority podcast, Dan.
Steven, that was fantastic. Thank you. Do you have a background in radio that I should know about here?
I do not, but thank you for asking. Well, so this is going to be an awesome conversation. I think very, very helpful. Like you and I were talking about in the green room. I think this is a problem that agency owners struggle with. And I shared with you in full transparency that this is something that I'm really looking forward to learning more from you about too, because I'm like, oh gosh, I'm going to be taking these and putting them right into the predictive lab, if you will, and in improving our business development too. So I'm really looking forward to being able to learn from you because I know that this is an area of expertise. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. before we do, take us behind the curtain and share with us a couple minutes, some context around your path and journey, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, for sure. So I basically, moved to New York City out of college, worked various internships and catering and stuff. And I sort of feel like if you don't know what you want to do and you end up in New York and you have a humanities major, you just kind of end up in the agency space. So this was like circa 2010. I worked for a social media shop back when like agencies could just be like, hey, we do social media. Community manager was like a title, and big companies would just give them all of their money to do this. So I was like sort of in this client coordinator role, pitching a lot of ideas that mostly went unread. Moved on from that job to a smaller creative services house. And I had this hybrid sales client service role, which I think is pretty similar to lots of agency owners and others kind of in higher up positions in boutique agencies. So I was constantly like shuffling back and forth between serving clients and dealing with fires and trying to drum up business. And we were selling mostly into enterprise Fortune 500s. We did a lot of high-end video and animation work. So when I was there, I tried everything under the sun to get meetings with very skeptical people. And I think that the markets have only become more skeptical, which is something that I can talk about. So, we did a whole lot of inbound, did a lot of outbound, went to lots of networking events, would go to things like BNI, get up early, go around the horn. And what I sort of figured out was there wasn't really a good system for people selling weird stuff to relatively rare people. We're selling complex services to relatively small and increasingly skeptical markets. So part of what I wanted to do with the book was to lay out a system for that is not entirely unfamiliar to, I think, most people that are doing this. The thing that's new is adding a certain amount of scale and leverage and repeatability to the process.
This is going to be such a fun conversation. And I know that our audience who is listening right now won't be able to see this, but I'm just going to hold it up to you or for your own book for reference. But this diagram that you have here on page 42, where you have, prospects and it almost looks like something out of astronomy. And then the outer circle are the lukewarms, which I know we're going to get to in just a little bit. But I love how you break down these different circles of influence, which I know we're also going to talk about too, because that ties right into the scale piece. But before we do that, you were mentioning the skepticism, right? Very skeptical markets for these unusual things to sell. So let's start with that first excerpt that I was quoting you from your book when you were talking about how the scarcity or that scarce commodity is no longer information, it's trust. So why do you believe that to be true?
For sure. So first off, I don't think I'm the only one to observe this. I think lots of people observe that we were in somewhat of a trust recession overall, like macro level. You could look at this, in terms of institutions, in terms of companies, in terms of everything. But to hone into a smaller lens here and looking at like agencies, I think the problem is that there's, it's becoming a mature market, and it already probably is, to sell creative services, to sell agency services. It's a business that can be started, with a laptop and an internet connection. So the markets have become more mature. It doesn't mean it's a bad business. It just means that it's changing the way that we have to sell it. And also, with that in mind, we've seen this situation where there's more and more people that have flooded into it, especially like post-COVID. The world's become more global. There's an indirect and indirect competition, both for business and just attention writ large. But even without all of that, even just going back to the beginning, complex service is people don't get to enjoy the benefits of that until weeks or months after they've hired the agency. But because most agencies haven't had a good model for selling themselves, they're trying to shoehorn a model that largely had products in mind, like software, was kind of created the predictable revenue model and all these other things that we use. And it doesn't really work that well because, the case studies, the collateral, the features, the benefits, all these things that have their place in the process don't really work very well at the top of the funnel when people are skeptical. So I might have lost your question, but that's kind of like what I see is, a lot of agencies being up against. Yeah.
Yeah. I love how you frame this up right at the top when you said there's a macro level. Yes, lots of people have talked about trust, but I have never heard somebody say a macro level trust recession. That's a great way to describe it.
Yeah. And I think that, anyway, like to get to what we're actually talking about, and I'll leave it at that so you can dig further into it. I think the things that you have to do when trust is the scarce resource are different than the things you have to do when just awareness is the scarce resource.
Okay. So let's go high level here. And I know that we're going to break this down and go eye level, and we're going to get into some more tactics and so forth. But I would love for you to sort of set the stage, if you will, for at a high level conceptually, when you talk about that you believe that there's, and I'm sort of putting words in your mouth, and then I know you'll break it down correctly, but that there's this balance between personalization and scale. So take us high level and give us your point of view around that. And then we'll get to the how somebody actually achieves that.
For sure. So first, let me frame out like what Outbound is and where it fits into things. So, most agencies are relying on reactive referrals and this stuff that's great, but it's not really predictable. And we're all about that. Your company's got predictive ROI. It's about doing something that's more proactive. So there's a million tactics, but the three basically are, reactive referrals, follow-on business, et cetera, inbound marketing, which is great, content, ads, and so on. And then there's Outbound. And I think that a lot of what's gone wrong with Outbound and a lot of why people aren't willing to try it, or they are willing to try it and they don't get results from it, is because they're going about it in the wrong way, and they're kind of given one of two paths for it. Path A is what I call in the book automation gang. To be completely honest, if I could rewrite it, I would probably call it something else, only because automation is not bad and it's not like we're never using automation, but there's this tendency to be like, well, I'm going to create this complex system for basically kind of like sending spam to my audience and creating this massive outreach terminator to go and to open up doors. And we all get those emails and we don't like them, and understandably people are like, I don't want to do that, because it usually doesn't work, and it increasingly doesn't work, and the results have even gotten worse with that. So that's path A. Path B is love letter game that I call in the book. And that's where, hey, I'm going to do this one-to-one outreach when me and the team have time, and it falls apart. It doesn't happen. There's a time and place to do that for higher leverage stuff for people that are already deeper in the funnel and engaged, but it's not really repeatable. And, when things get busy, it all falls apart. So basically, what I talk about in the book is this idea of finding a Goldilocks zone by, it's not like you never go on cold, but emphasizing the sorts of prospects that are already likely to trust the agency based on things they have in common.
Yeah. I think it was so great. In fact, I found myself smiling as I was reading through your section on the automation gang, because you're right. We all get emails like that. It feels like a blunt instrument. Like they don't know me. It's clear based on how they sent or what they sent or the context of this email that they don't know me. And it's sort of like, this will be a crude example, but essentially the red solo cup guy at a party who goes up to every person in the bar, every person that he may find attractive, and tries to get to third base in the first 5 minutes, that typically doesn't work out well for that person. And we've all experienced that in a social context or whatever. It's gross. Nobody likes it. And it really shows a level of immaturity. And certainly when we're talking about in business, absolutely immaturity. So when I read that, I'm like, yep, we all get those emails and they feel like a whole lot of not awesome. So anyway, I smiled when I read your automation gang. So can you take this, the gang piece, and go back to, let's just rewind some context here, because I think the origin story of this is really, really cool. Like when you were on those commuter trains and going into the city and doing all those networking meetings and that kind of stuff, you keenly saw, I think you called it like the real estate posse. Am I remembering that correctly? Right? Can you give us some golden nuggets out of that story? Because I think that sort of ties into this sort of gang metaphor, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically this is zooming back in time a lot. And I was, going to these networking events and, kind of around the horn BNI like groups where people traded leads. And the fact was, like, they would measure the amount of business that was being done. And there was one group of people that would like account for like 90% of the business. And it was the real estate people, because they had this like ecosystem where they would just trade leads back and forth. They basically had this tribe. And, we probably got some closes from all the networking, but we sold kind of weird stuff to like a pretty small total addressable market. And this was before the internet was as big of a thing as it is, right? So like there was a lot more of this local component to it. But the fact was, like, the reason that the real estate posse had so much success was that they had that trust built in, and they were able to kind of like leverage that. It happened to be referrals, but the same dynamics are at play if you're reaching out directly through mutual connections and things you have in common with people. It's the same, mental triggers. So I don't think I realized it back then. I wasn't that savvy. I was much younger. But in hindsight, that kind of stuck with me as, well, what if you could harness that same dynamic digitally, right? And do it at relative scale, or at least in a leveraged way. So that was kind of the origin story. Even then, it didn't catch on right when I started Sales Schema, which is our business. So for context, we do outreach for agencies and help them get leads. In the last year, we've pivoted to more of like a training model where we're helping agencies set up these systems and run them and so on. But anyway, like for years, we did the cold outreach Terminator gang thing, partially because it used to work better, partially because we hadn't developed a better way. Right.
Yeah.
So the next part of the origin story was like around maybe 2016, 2017. It was declining in effectiveness. And we had this client that was like perfectly positioned. They had worked with every blue chip tech company under the sun. And we did the usual model, not dissimilar from what you'd see in like predictable revenue, where it's like, okay, we're going to build this funnel, we're going to run LinkedIn outreach, email, text, so on, to get meetings. And we tried every permutation. We tried case studies. We tried collateral, doing this, doing that, different senders, long form, short form. Nothing was really working. And we kind of were like, all right, they're going to let us go anytime. If it's not working for these guys who are perfectly positioned in a growing market, like who's this going to work for? Right. And also from being in peer groups and stuff, we're like, I don't think we're alone. Like everybody's kind of not having success with this. So we said, all right, we're going to try something different. We're going to find prospects that used to work for the agency's biggest client, or one of their biggest clients. I forget which one it was. Let's say it was Symantec. And then we're going to find everybody that's gone on to other relevant companies like HP or Microsoft, whatever. And we're going to send them a 2-line email, which was to the fact of, hey, Bob, saw you used to work for Symantec. We've done a lot of business with them. Saw you're over here now. We should probably talk. That got dozen plus meetings. One went on to close for multi 6 figures. And that like very much planted the seed. We're like, that's kind of interesting because like what did we not do there? We offered value only in the loosest possible interpretation of the word, right? It wasn't really like a value offer. We didn't send people case studies. We didn't send people collateral. We didn't like do all the things that everyone's saying that you have to do. But we basically said, we projected in a subtle way that I am in your world and we should probably talk, right? So I think overall, like one of my favorite marketing thinkers is Rory Sutherland. And he always, hammers home this idea that we like to pretend that we're very rational in the B2B space, but we're just as irrational as everyone else. And the thing that is getting the meeting is not all of this information. It's something else. And that's kind of what we were honing in on with this.
Yeah, I mean, we make decisions. To your point, we like to think that we're rational beings, that we make decisions based on data and inputs and stats and all the things. But the reality is that we make decisions based on one word, and that's hope, that tomorrow is somehow going to be better than today if I make these decisions. And when I hear the semantic example, that's establishing that bridge of commonality. Oh, I'm hopeful that this person can help me, and I'm confident that they might be able to, or at least using your words from the book, de-risk having the conversation because they're quasi-known entity because of the bridge you created with using semantic, right?
Right. Exactly. And there's plenty of other commonalities that we've run throughout the years. Like one of the most common ones we look at is geographic, even if it doesn't matter at all, just because on a personal level, it's just a cut above what everyone else is doing. And it's inherently scarce, right? Because everybody's trying to do the mass automation AI game where they're like, how do I just turn on a switch and just do this forever without having to change it? Our whole approach is like, let's look at these pockets of commonality where the overall approach is scalable, but each campaign is not, because most people aren't willing to do that. And that's why it works.
Love this. So let me cement this example, the semantics example, into place here, going back to the 3 gangs that you had mentioned before: automation, love letter, Goldilocks. The semantic example is an example of Goldilocks, like out in the wild, right?
Exactly. And for context, like everyone's situation is different and every market's different, but we might be averaging just a few hundred people contacted per week, right? Which sounds like a lot, but that's, a few dozen per day. And that lets us hit that sweet spot, more easily than trying to contact thousands and you get it wrong and and so on. So.
Right. Okay. This is fantastic. So I know we're going to come back to Goldilocks with a few additional examples because, well, let me rephrase. At least I think we might. But so when we talk about lukewarms, that's where you're essentially doing the Goldilocks strategy, Goldilocks gang at scale, correct?
Yeah, and I can kind of frame that out if that would be helpful.
Okay, perfect.
So in the book, I talk about the work of this sociologist named Robin Dunbar, right, who developed this idea of Dunbar's number, which is like basically the number of people, the number of acquaintances that we can keep in our lives. But it's not
Okay.
the only circle. It kind of goes out roughly by triples. So you have a circle of five, who's like your family, your closest friends, people you confide in. 15, which is kind of that expanded, like your close friends that you would have dinner with and to confide in as well. And then it goes out by thirds to Dunbar's number, which is like the number of people you might invite to a wedding or something, and so on. And then there's the number of just faces and names you can keep in your head. And our experience and our hypothesis is that there's a big circle that might be thousands and thousands of people that are basically what we call lukewarms, right?
Mm.
Which is not Dunbar's idea. This is our idea from just doing this a long time. And basic definition of that are people that don't know you, but would be willing to talk to you based on something you have in common with them, either on a business or personal level. And that's kind of the idea that frames a lot of how we approach this kind of thing.
Okay, so in your book where you mentioned, and I love how you frame this up, you said, I'm quoting you again on page 41, you said, with that in mind, I'm going to be so bold as to suggest a sixth circle. Love the humility there. I think that is really cool. And then you said 5,000 lukewarm. So just to make sure that I'm tracking with you, you're rounding up a little bit, not much, but you're taking Dunbar's 1,500 familiars, taking that by three or multiplying that by three, and then that's how you get the 5,000 lukewarms, right?
Yeah, around that much. It's kind of napkin math, but
Yeah.
I think it stands to reason that that number could even be a lot bigger than that. If you're thinking about anybody that would be willing to talk to you once you start sort of stacking these things you have in common, right? Like, i.e., we've done a lot of work with companies that are just like yours, combined with we also have these things in common personally. I think that number actually gets a lot bigger than that, but I think 5,000's perhaps that, kind of working with Dunbar's thirds rule there.
Okay. And so then you're putting forth the notion of, or strategy, I guess, sort of like a Venn diagram, if you will, the two circles coming together where they would overlap in the center. And on the left, we've got your market. On the right, there's the shared commonalities. And then in the center where they overlap, it's be here. So I think if I'm tracking with you, it's okay, you got these 5,000 lukewarms. And yes, you may be able to use a CRM to try and figure out like who the lukewarms might be based on behaviors and that kind of stuff or whatever. But don't be a blunt instrument and reach out to all 5,000 with the same thing. Let's think about like the market and the commonalities, be here where the overlaps are, and then do something smart like Goldilocks. Am I tracking with you?
Exactly. And I think the issue is like, and this is very common in the agency space because people are so used to referrals and so used to only talking with people at this later part of the buying cycle. We both know Robert Rose, maybe he's not the first to identify this, but buyer is not a person, it's a state. It's a state somebody goes through.
Mm.
So, with that in mind, what Outbound does is it's really meant not to be just a lead gen channel. It is that, right? And it can be that when you get lucky and the timing is right. But really what it is, the healthier way to think of it is as a relationship building channel. So, before we work with a client, we're like, are you interested in just building relationships in your market, like regardless of immediate need? Because there's so much energy, and I'm not knocking intent data. It has its place. It can be very valuable, but a lot of the times people are spinning their wheels trying to identify who's ready to buy right now. And the issue with that is A, it's a very small sliver, needle in a haystack problem. But B, even if they agree to talk to you, which isn't always the case, guess who they're going to do business with? The person that already, or the company that already built trust with them. How did that company build trust with them? Well, they opened the door and established a relationship and nurtured and did all those things. So our whole thing is like, how do you just get that door open, more easily?
Yeah, when Drew McClellan and I, who I know that when he and I wrote the book Sell with Authority, our book, one of the things that we put in there is to set expectations of it could be a day or a decade. And the key is like if you're going to position your agency in a particular niche and that you have expertise and that kind of stuff, then the challenge is how can you show up helpful every time that person turns around, there you are with a helpful answer to an important question without the trying to stick your finger into their wallet. That you're just trying to be helpful without any expectation of return. Which then, when I think about that and our point of view around that, and I think about Goldilocks, I'm like, oh, those two just go hand in hand. It's like, you gotta be helpful, nurture, 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 nurture. And then with Goldilocks, it's, yes, knocking on the door without showing up like a schmutz, right?
Exactly. And I think that there's the high level conceptual stuff, and then there's the actual tactical making this work sort of thing.
Mm.
And I think that getting to the how of this, assuming people are with me so far with the what, a lot of the times, like there's all these great tactics, right, that agencies are offered, but the team is like an owner that's doing other stuff, or maybe there's one biz dev person, right, that's like heads down on proposals every few days and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
part of it's also like the other thing that's cool about this approach and getting to the Goldilocks zone is you get a process that's actually manageable,
Yeah.
right? It's not, we're not like there's a value to adding more channels and to using LinkedIn. There's also a lot more complexity and work. So like we're starting with email, one channel a lot of the times to do this. And it works not because of massive amounts of persistence and complexity, but because of starting on the right footing by identifying the right people and then sending the right words to them, basically.
Okay, so then just to go back through that just a little bit more, just to make sure that we're 100% on the same page. So those two pieces there, you mentioned two components. If you're going to do Goldilocks well, then you have to have these two components, the list and then the right content or copy, right?
Exactly. To dig further into that, I think understandably people want to go right to the copy, right? Because it's fun, it's easiest to change. It's a lever that you can pull really easily, and it does matter a lot. But a lot of the times the list is kind of, so the list is relegated, and it's sort of like, well, we just can go here and buy a list and have it work. So like when people ask, hey, what's your secret sauce? What are you doing differently? A lot of it is the stuff we're talking about, the commonalities and being able to find those people. But a whole other element, probably like 70, 80% of it is just the quality control, right? So that you're starting by identifying the companies and then the people, like you're building a house and then kind of going on from there. So the company list, it's like, hey, we sell into fintech. Well, guess what? If you check most filters and most data sources, even with AI, even with Zoom info, all this stuff, Apollo, there's no really great way to sift out fintech from finance, from banks and all the other financial services. And getting it a little bit wrong is kind of like turning the ship like 3 degrees in the wrong direction, and then like you're in Alaska versus Hawaii or something, right? So a lot of it is just having a process that is repeatable, for somebody, it doesn't have to be the owner, but somebody in the company that understands the strike zone of the agency to go in and say like, are we actually in the right place with this messaging, right? Or is this going to the wrong companies and the wrong people? Just getting that right goes so much further because most people aren't willing to do that.
Yeah, during our July intensive, that's a private event where we bring our clients together every March, July, November, and then we invite some guests. We were sharing with them our list building process, like strategy and then the tactical steps, all the things in full transparency. And one of the things that we mentioned was we had just purchased a list of agencies and we wanted to do an experiment over essentially data integrity and quality because we were super curious. Like if we bought a list of like 42,000 agencies, like how good was the list? How accurate was the list? So this is going to maybe sound like a ridiculous example for you, Dan, or our audience, but we literally had our teammates. We have a group of teammates who are sales development representatives, right? And so then they went through every single line of that database, 42,000 records, and only about 25% were good. So then I just happened to meet with the person that we bought the list from later, and he's a good friend, and we were not upset or anything like that or whatever. And when I mentioned that to him, he goes, "Oh, well, yeah, that's kind of typical when you purchase a list." So it was an amazing experiment because you warn against that in your book. Like, don't just buy a list and then aimlessly blast to that list because, like you point out in your book, like doing that could absolutely destroy your sender reputation if you don't check the data and actually build a good, targeted, curated list.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. It's almost like if you want to eat healthy and stuff, like you probably shouldn't go out to eat as much, right? You're gonna like cook at home more. It's a little bit like that, and I think that when people hear that, they're like, "I'm busy." It sounds tedious, and it can be, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the way to reframe that is the other benefit to that people don't appreciate is just the amount of clarity you get about who is a good fit and who is not by having to go through that list. Don't wait to fix it later. Like once you've built this broken car and you don't know why it's smoking and has fire all over it, like build it right to begin with. You front load that work, but also you're understanding like, oh, okay, like we said that healthcare is our strike zone, but these companies aren't a fit. We didn't think about that. Like we don't want to work with rehab centers. We actually want to work with med spas. And like it looks like we have to actually decide on that by having to build this list and contact people.
Yep.
So there's a huge benefit to going through that process. And that's a lot of what we're doing with the agencies we work with early on.
So as we come in for a landing here, I'm gonna ask you to share maybe just some tactical sort of steps, like 1, 2, 3, as it relates to Goldilocks. We've already talked about like list and copy, and there's probably a couple of others, like some nuanced stuff, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Before we do that though, like how much does testing play into this as far as like, do you suggest like some A/B testing? Do you suggest, you know what, send 10 messages and in order to test the copy, and then you might scale it from there? So how from your perspective, how does testing fit into the methodology?
Really good question. The thing that's hard about B2B, especially once we're getting more specialized and you're going up market, is you have much smaller sample size than what most agencies experience with their clients if they're doing like consumer ads or whatever it is, right? So that's the thing that makes it harder and more frustrating. So usually, what we're looking at is like a window of no less than 30 days, campaigns that have had several hundred up to like 1,000 people contacted. And usually that's involving like multiple touch points. We're not into contacting people a dozen times. Like usually what we're doing is an initial touch that's doing most of the heavy lifting and a very casual bump. Like, hey, did you get this? Because people are busy. And because there's a downside to being over persistent before somebody has opened the door to you, right? In terms of sender rep and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Tactically, that's how we're thinking about testing. I think though, before, going too far into the tactics, usually the most important consideration is like, A, how important is this to be opening doors and so on? Is this something you're willing to commit to? But B, who is going to be the person doing this, right? The who question as opposed to the what. And the reality is, like, as I'm sure you're used to, in most agencies, that's often the owner, or maybe there's a biz dev person. So what that usually means is like the owner getting as much fulfillment off of his or her plate so that they can budget the time to like build this system, perhaps with internal help from the team, and get it going and so on from there.
Yeah. And so my guess is that, some owners in our audience right now hear you say that and go, I don't have the time, space, capacity to even think about this, because using one of your words a few minutes ago, which I think was very accurate when you said some of this work, not all of it, but some of this work can be tedious. So is there a way to essentially kind of maybe delegate away some of the tediousness of it, and so that an owner can be sitting in more of a strategic role and maybe not have to push all the buttons? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we've developed the training program for this, which we call the targeted outreach system, we've sort of honed in on the best model. And what we're finding is that the sweet spot is like 1 or 2 people. So the owner with an assistant, and that assistant, we've seen it work a variety of ways. It could be a client service person that can shave off a couple hours a week. It could be, an SDR or like a biz dev person that's in training or that's lower level. We've seen people have it work with a freelancer. I think the important thing is that person isn't just some rando. Like they should understand what the agency does, who they want to reach. They don't have to be like experts on everything, but they should get that. And they don't have to be a coder or super technical, but they shouldn't be afraid of like a piece of software and, the list building providers and stuff. So I think that if that's in place and the owner's involved on, kind of in the higher level and the copy in terms of like determining, okay, this is our strike zone, then it can work really well. And that can save a lot of time for owners for sure if they have that role in place.
Love the baseball reference. When you said strike zone, I'm like, ooh, all right. What if he is actually a baseball fan?
It's funny. I want to go to a baseball game. It's been a while though, and I've been in New York for 14 years, and I'm a Nationals fan though. So It's always
Okay.
I'm always an enemy.
All right. Man, that's got to be tough, right? To be in New York City and not be either a Yankees or a Mets fan. But I'm so glad to hear you say that because I hate the Yankees. Anyway.
Yeah, me too. Either way, I'm in enemy territories.
Yeah. Okay. So I know that we need to come in for a landing. So if you were to highlight tactical steps with respect to Goldilocks, we know how important the list is in the copy. How might you like sum this up with a bow on it for our audience if they wanted to go down this path?
Yeah, I don't know if I can do a bow, but I can lay out at least a few steps.
Yeah.
I think again, first deciding who is doing this, like 1 to 2 person team, being able to budget a total of probably like 5 to 10 hours a week to get this thing built. That's going to happen in the first 90 days, and then from there, keeping it simple. There's a lot of the times there's a tendency to just do the thing that the Series A funded sales team is doing, but to get tactical, like can you identify the decision makers in specific companies that are literally in your backyard, right? And for some agencies might say, oh, we know them, or that's not going to work for these reasons. Okay, well, continuing with just the geographic idea, are you going to any trade shows or conferences in the next 12 months?
Yep.
Well, there you go. Like, could you be building those relationships ahead of time and saying, hey, I'm going to be in this area at this time. We've worked with clients like yours. I would love to get on a call for 15 minutes. So guess what? Almost nobody's doing that, especially that have the experience of the agency where they're going to go on your site and say, wow, they actually have worked with fintech. So those are all things that can be run pretty easily with like email, which has plenty of noise, downsides, pros and cons, like everything else. But it's still where we go to make plans and do business. And it's as good as any other channel to start with.
So good.
A few ideas. There's more to it, but a few starting places anyway.
Oh my gosh. Great conversation. I am so very grateful, Dan, for you sharing your expertise. You gave me a lot of notes, 4 pages of notes, in fact, to be exact. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So I know that we need to come in for a landing, but before we close out and say goodbye, I know we covered a lot. Anything you think we might have missed? And then what is the best way for our audience to reach out and connect with you, Dan?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you. This is fantastic. I'm having you on our show as well, and I need to budget time for homework so that I don't feel horrible because this is great, and I really appreciate all the work you put in.
Welcome.
So first off, I guess like anything we didn't cover, nothing jumps out in particular. I think more just a reminder that I think that if you're only thinking about outbound as a way to like silver bullet, get leads and close business in the next 90 days, you might not have the fortitude to make it work. Like anything, it's going to take time and effort, but it's really worth it because it allows you to decide who you want to work with and build relationships with them and not necessarily pay tech companies for the pleasure of interacting with your audience. So that's the benefit to it. I also think that if you can reframe it as a clarifying exercise, as a way to get better and stronger in every regard, like the marketing you're doing, because you're going to understand your market better, you're going to have a much better time with it as well. So those are probably just points of emphasis. Yeah. And beyond that, the thing we're doing now is we have a video training. It's about 50 minutes. It goes through just more into the tactics and how we're doing this and examples and case studies and stuff. I think what we'll do is set up a custom link and we'll just make that sales.com/SWA, sell with authority, and that'll go to that landing page.
Okay, that sounds awesome. And we will be sure to put that into the episode's show notes as well. And okay, everyone, no matter how many notes you took or how often you go back and re-listen to Dan's words of wisdom, which I sure hope that you do, you have to take all of this. You have to take the Goldilocks strategy that he broke down and gave to you in all the steps. You have to take it and apply it, because when you do, you will sell more of what you do. So Dan, again, thank you very much. We all have the same 86,400 seconds in a day. And I am grateful that you took time out of your schedule to come onto the show, to be our mentor and guide, to help us move our agencies onward to that next level. Thank you so much, Dan.
Steve, thank you so much. This has been great, and look forward to having you on our show as well.